If you can get someone to think of a stranger as a member of their group, they like that person more. And they like that person more even if they belong to a different race, gender, religion, nationality, what have you.
The scientist you're about to hear from performs basically like a magic trick. At least that's what it felt like to me. I have watched him put little kids together into very random circumstances, and very quickly, within 90 seconds, this guy has these kids making wild assumptions about one another. His name is Yarrow Dunham, and he studies the ways in which prejudice across race and nationality and gender and the rest of it is present in us from a disturbingly young age. He has done these experiments for more than 10 years, and in that time has really helped to show that the wiring of our brains causes us to group together in a real kind of tribal way to an extent that people didn't really understand before now. And the bad news, of course, is that that creates the opportunity for incredibly divisive politics, incredibly powerful marketing, and a general capacity for suspicion of one another that is pretty dark to think about. The good news is that it's also a lever you can pull in the other direction. And he's been doing some really incredible and I would argue pretty hopeful making work in that direction. We talk here about all the ways in which his research has shown us how our brains group ourselves into the groups that can be trusted, not trusted, how deeply our instincts around fairness run, and how all of that is porting over into the social media and, more importantly, into the AI age. He's got some really interesting ideas about how we might fix that going forward. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Yarrow Dunham. Yarrow Dunham, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Jake.
So about a year ago, what am I talking about? 10 years ago almost, you and I first met, and I witnessed some of the earliest work, an early example of the work that you've been doing, in which you sat down with a little girl and put her into a randomly assigned shirt, and then within like 90 seconds, you had this girl making wild assumptions about other kids based on this stuff. And I have literally cited that work weekly, I think, ever since. And so maybe you could just give people a little crash course into what this work is, and specifically why kids? Why are we going at 3 to 5-year-olds in the work that you do?
So, yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, Jake. I mean, I think, so the kind of work that you're talking about there that I've been doing with kids has a long history in social psychology more generally. I'm really going all the way back to the 70s. And it comes out of this kind of big picture question about like, why does something like prejudice, broadly defined, right? Some tendency to like our own groups more than other groups. Why is that so ubiquitous, like across cultures, across history, across all different kinds of groups? And one of the kind of big questions is the extent to which merely belonging to a group, I've sometimes used this phrase, mere membership, just the mere fact of being a member of a group. To what extent does that in and of itself produce forms of bias? And you can imagine that, we like lots of things that are associated with the self. We like, there's famous work in behavioral economics where we like the beer of the mug that we were given and we overvalue it relative to someone else. We like the letters that are in our name more than the letters that are not in our name. So there's lots of reason to think we might just like things that we're associated with, but obviously social groups are really meaningful and really enduring. And so this work going back to very early on would do things like it started out with a kind of adolescents and adults, and they might do something like have them sort of judge some different paintings. And it turned out the paintings were by various abstract expressionist artists like Klee and Kandinsky. And you would make some decisions and they would say, Jake, okay, you're a Klee liker. You prefer Klee. And then they would have you rate other individuals that were described as either sharing your group, being in the Klee liker group, or being a Kandinsky liker. And they would basically just sort of, or they might have you divide money between members of the two groups and so on. And the very common and really kind of much repeated, really well replicated findings that you're going to like the people in your own group more, you're going to give more to them. We've gone on to do work that you'll remember more positive things about them and more negative things about the other group. Even things like if we give you essays that are ostensibly written by members of the two groups, you'll just like the essays for members of your own group better. You'd maybe, for example, assign them higher grades, things like that. And so a whole this huge wide range of biases seems to crop up like very quickly and very immediately. And I think my big contribution was starting to look at this developmentally and really asking the question, if we really want to understand like the ubiquity of all these forms of bias, that we might just automatically prefer any old group we're assigned to seems really relevant. And I kind of thought of it as this like developmental cascade, right? There's a moment when a child, maybe say a 4-year-old, starts to realize, oh, something like race, say, is important in my culture. We divide people up based on this complex, physical dimension that involves skin color and other things. When a 4-year-old first discovers that, they don't have any like rich understanding of the cultural history of race or the genetic basis of race or lack thereof or any of that, right? They just know, oh, here's a way that my culture tends to divide people up. And I got really interested in the kind of disturbing possibility that right then and there, if kids start to prefer their own group, that's going to kind of start a developmental cascade. Right now, if you're remembering more good things about your own group than the other group, if you're just kind of finding it easier to interact with people, even on the basis of just that very basic in-group, out-group, like what are the consequences of that over time? And can that help to explain how things kind of get cemented? So that's, I think, the kind of backstory of a lot of the work that I've done in that line.
And so my instinct in listening to you describe it and witnessing as I have the work that you've done specifically with kids, my instinct is then to be like, well, if it's in kids, then it's obviously just a deep piece of circuitry that we are born with. Clearly, this is something, these kids are too young to have picked up anything from their social environment. They're just obviously responding to some kind of inborn circuitry. What have you found about that?
Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that, though, as psychologists, we're really interested in like characterizing that in a little more detail, right? So I think this tendency is really early emerging. There's evidence now from a little bit that I was involved with and some other work as well, that this might even happen in, infants, where if infants think they have some arbitrary similarity with someone else, like, choosing the same color of little mittens, that they might like those people more or prefer those people. So there's something about it that's so early emerging that, yes, I think we can say there is something, we often use this word innate, right? There's something kind of natural or innate about it. What it exactly is, though, I think is still a hard question. I don't think we 100% know the answer to. Because for example, I mentioned all of those biases about letters, and like we like the letters in our own name. That's not an innate bias in the sense that like evolution did not prepare us to like letters, right? There were no letters, there were no written languages, there was no orthography, et cetera, right? And so but perhaps something that's sort of more basic, for example, a general tendency to have a lot of self-directed positivity and to kind of overestimate our own abilities, which you could imagine being a kind of a functional bias to have, like keep trying, like the people around you because you likely are going to have to rely on them. So something very basic like that might be that kind of core that then sort of spills over into all of these other things. So whether it's really richly a social bias where what evolution has taught us is like members of your own group, or if it's something a little more general, like be very positively predisposed towards yourself and things that are connected to yourself, I think is still a kind of a web we have to kind of untangle a little more.
Yeah, right. And so in both of those cases, these are sort of leading me toward the question of what is this for? Like what's the evolutionary purpose of this tendency? First of all, are you somebody who is comfortable explaining stuff, theorizing about the evolutionary purpose of this
absolutely.
stuff? Like,
I mean, yes,
some people hate that, right? Some people do not want to do that. But you're not one of those people, right?
With the caveat that it's speculation and that, that these are very hard things to really pin down. I tend to think, I've written about this a little bit, that I think there are two things going on. I think one is the one I was just alluding to, which is this idea that we seem to have some biases to generally be very positively predisposed towards ourselves and towards things that are connected with ourselves. So that I think of as a lower level thing that is not about groups per se. That's just a kind of like yourself and like things that you're connected to. And that's why you can get biases in favor of the letters of your name. That's why there are a lot of tendencies, at least in most cultures, to overestimate one's own ability and one's own contribution to things and so on.
Right.
So those are not specifically like group based or like, intergroup bias or prejudice related. I tend to think also, though, that there's something that maybe has its origins in our cooperative tendency. So humans are like a really, really remarkably cooperative species. We engage in this long-term cooperation and long-term forms of reciprocity where I can do you a favor today. And, in a year, I can be like, hey, Jake, could you maybe help me out with this thing that I know you know more about? Or I know you know this person. Could you connect me? And a year later, even though now you're not going to invite me on your podcast again or whatever, you probably would be inclined to help me out because we believe in these long-term reciprocal relationships. And that
And
allows us to do
you said that's
cooperation over long periods, right?
you said that's remarkable. Are we fairly alone in the animal world of people? Don
Yes.
Corleone calls in the florist to do him the
Yes, that's right.
favor, the undertaker to do him the favor. That is
Yes.
only we do
Yes.
that.
Yeah, pretty much. As far as we know, pretty much only we do that really,
Hmm.
really long-term form of cooperation or reciprocity with biologically unrelated strangers, or not strangers, obviously, but biologically unrelated
Right.
people.
Right.
And of course, that's cool. And that's a huge part of why we can build these really complex social structures, these really complex societies. And one idea that I do find, I think, at least very intriguing is that there's always like the reason cooperation is hard to sustain is sometimes called the problem of free riders. It's like, I'm now I do you a favor now and you've gotten what you want. So like, why later should you pay the cost to return the favor at a cost to yourself, right?
Hmm.
And that's very hard to overcome. But one idea is that this tendency to kind of identify a little circle of people that you're likely to cooperate with, let's call that your in-group, and to basically ramp up some senses of positivity and reciprocity to help sustain that longer term cooperation. So this might be a mechanism, there might be some mechanisms geared towards sustaining cooperation in humans. And they can be pretty flexible. Like you can be in my group now and then not later. And like when you're in my group, I can get this little kind of warm glow of like trust and positivity that will help sustain cooperation.
And in terms of that sort of capacity for preferring one's tribe, I'm thinking this is right. Do we have any sense, or do you have any speculation about how many people, like, so here's my example. Here's what I'll throw at you. So I spent time around the same time that you and I met. I had just come from spending time with this tribe in Tanzania called the Hadza, which is of course well known to you and to people in your field as a tribe that basically lives like we all did 100,000 years ago. No last names, no property, no they don't raise crops, and they don't have a word for a number greater than 5. Right. There's nothing in their vocabulary for that. And the logic being, I just, everybody sort of says, well, because why would you need that? More than 5 people is a lot of people. And, see you in more than 5 moons is later. I'm not making plans more than 5 moons in advance. Right. And I'm wondering if you think that this capacity that we have for this in-group, out-group instinct that you have documented so well, do you think is it designed to keep us in a cooperative long-term relationship with a pretty small group? Or do you think can that circuitry
Yeah.
just as easily handle lots and lots and lots of people?
Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent it turns out that it can handle lots of people, because if you think like the kinds of things I have in mind is that you can be traveling in another country and like find an American or find someone from your same hometown or find someone who likes the same band that you like, these kind of arbitrary groups of strangers. And we can use that little one element of commonality of like shared identity. And it works, right? It's actually that form of kind of homophily, a preference for the similar, often is connected in this kind of vague way to many different forms of social identity.
Yeah.
Now, I think I think that's compatible with the idea that it evolved, of course, in the context of these small scale societies. But even then, right, my understanding of how many of these groups worked is you might have a very small band that you're with on the day to day, right? Like that might be, 20, 50 people, but you might also be part of a larger kind of distributed community of other people who are part of your broader cultural group, but that you don't see that much. And so it can kind of have this nested structure, which I think is quite interesting, where you can have, they're all Americans, and then they're all Americans who live where I live in New Haven, or
Right.
all professors, and then all Yale professors, and then all Yale psychology professors. And so there are these kind of concentric circles, right, of increasing identification.
Right. So in a moment, I want to get to how that all gets into kind of the organization of everyone online, which has now
Yeah.
become, of course, a feature of our digital lives. But before we do that, let's stick with the research that you have been doing. And I'm looking back across the work you've done, and it's I can see that what you were investigating when we met in whatever that was, 2015, 2016, has now expanded to look past just this sort of the basics of like, do kids inherit bias and how quickly can you transmit bias between kids into now you've really gotten into much more nuanced questions of a kid's understanding of abstract and real world social groups. That's another paper. The question of whether minimal group biases, this arbitrarily assigned categories question, holds across majority and minority children. So tell me a little bit about just sort of like where this is taking you and where your understanding of this is sharpening over time.
Yeah. So, right. I think there are a few lines maybe that I can mention quickly. I mean, one comes back actually to some of your last sets of questions about like, what function or what role do these biases play? And I think one paper that I think was really interesting in this case is we just kind of explored the hypothesis related to things I was just saying, that maybe one reason we have this bias is it's sort of preparing you for action, it's preparing you for cooperative action. So, even if you think about, imagine you're doing some like classroom activity where we divide everyone up. And so you, Jake, you find yourself in a group of 4 other people. Well, obviously what's going to happen next is you're going to all work on something together. You're going to be in some broadly cooperative context. And what if it helps to make that cooperation go well, to just sort of upregulate the positivity you have towards that little group, the sense of belonging you have in that little group? So what we did with both kids and adults in this study is we assigned kids to minimal groups based on the t-shirt color. We just randomly assigned them to a t-shirt color. And then we had them we basically rigged a little kind of an online interaction. So we had them, they met an in-group member and an out-group member on a computer, like on a laptop, a little video of them. And we said, okay, now that you've met them, in a minute, we're going to pair you up with the members of your own group and you're going to do a little activity. And then in one condition, that's what happened. And the kids did a little activity with a kind of a fake activity. Actually, it was all kind of rigged with video, and then we kind of measured their biases and they much preferred their own group. But in the other condition, there was a little glitch and we said, oh no, the connection didn't work. I guess we're going to have to connect you with someone from the other group so that you can interact with them and you're going to do the activity with them instead. And what we found is in that condition, the difference between in-group and out-group went away. The out-group, they still liked their original group, but instead of like this being their own group, that being the other group, the out-group jumped up to the same level of liking. And that happened even if they never had the interaction, even before they actually interacted. So basically the way that I thought about this is this seems like this is preparing you to have a positive interaction. And normally there's a strong default assumption. Obviously I'm going to interact with my own group. If we give people a strong expectation that they are about to interact with members of the other group, then there's a way in which that group either gets included in some new way, or you now just realize I need to be positive towards this group too. I'm about to go do things with them, right? I think we can think about that in terms of contact, where like contact often is good. If you go do activities together with people from another group, that's like one of the most time-honored ways to like reduce prejudice and increase understanding. And this is, I think, one piece of that is this kind of preparation for action.
I find myself, I'm very kind of, heartened by that. Like I feel good. I like hearing that because so much I like you. You're a nice guy, but your work is a bummer sometimes, right? Like some of the findings.
Yeah,
are
we have a joke
bummer.
about this. Is that sometimes, I'll realize I'm telling a colleague, "Oh my God, we found the coolest thing." Like 3-year-olds are like, whatever, racist in this
Deeply
other way.
racist, yeah.
And then I'm like, wait, no, okay, not you know what I mean? Not cool.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's terrible.
That's funny.
I hate that.
We call in television news, we call that the news great. So someone will say to me, this person had this horrific experience and they've come to us to tell us about a horrific experience. And then you say to that producer, that's great. And then then there's a long pause between you and you say, I don't mean that's great. I mean, it's great that she wants to talk to us. And they go, yeah, right, exactly. So yes, I know the producer great, the psychologist great. So are you heartened by that? Like, is that a source of comfort?
And, so I'm heartened in the sense that it's a surprisingly easy sort of lever to pull, right? To like create opportunities where you're going to interact across lines. Maybe, something that maybe we could come back to in the kind of second part of our conversation. It does, when we think about how polarized our world has become, and we think about how much we now know about online, the kind of the separation that we get in our networks, so much more so than, compared to the original promise where this is going to allow for all this connection effect, then it becomes worrying because we have even less of this actual experience, right? We have even less of those experiences of being like, or I'm going to go meet with the lawmakers from the other side of the aisle to try to reach compromise. Like those sorts of things don't happen as much anymore in our increasingly kind of polarized world, or, and then in our everyday lives as well, where our kind of social networks, both online and real, tend to be increasingly, polarized into people who share our beliefs. And so that crossing the aisle seems like it's happening less. And so
Yeah.
the promise of this finding is maybe not being realized as much as they could.
But the nice thing to think about is that if you really could get them, if you could somehow glitch their day and put them all together on
Yep.
a water balloon fight or whatever the thing is, right? Or it sounds like a cooperative task is really what it is. That if you could get them together building houses for Habitat for Humanity or something, a day
That's
of
right.
that can bring people together who otherwise would be very predisposed not to spend
That's
any
right.
time
That's right.
together.
Or various kinds of, obviously we don't want this, but various kinds of crisis or something that force a certain, force people to try to work together or force a common purpose.
Yeah.
Those things can have those positive effects. And we have seen that, in the data in the past.
Yeah. So then before we get to the digital thing, the other thing that the other paper I really want to hear about is one that you have around fairness and the desire of kids to punish unfairness.
Yeah.
It's a paper called Third Party Punishment of Unfair Sharing. And as I understand it, I'm just summarizing here, so correct me if I'm wrong here. Cross-cultural evidence shows that children in 6 societies will enforce fairness by punishing unfair sharing, even if they're not directly involved. And I think even if it sort of costs them to do so, that even if it's somewhat expensive to them. So tell me about this, because that's super interesting too, is that not only is this there isn't just a kind of warm connection to your own group, there's also some other very strong piece of circuitry at work, or maybe this is a socialized thing, you tell me, that has people really upset when they observe unfairness and antisocial behavior. I don't know, you break it down for me, but I'm really interested by this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this was work that was led by a former postdoc in my lab and now a professor at Boston College, Katie McAuliffe. And with a whole team, obviously, anytime you're doing this cross-cultural research, you do, 6 societies usually means more than 6 people, as you're building out your team. And I think this builds, so there's a much larger body of work that many people have been a part of, looking at this really interesting period, especially in kind of middle childhood, where kids are really, really invested in fairness. And while there's some cultural variation in some of this, it includes cases in which when kids are themselves involved, they'll refuse an advantaged split of resources. So in other words, like if I'm the kid and you are like, there's 6 candies and Yarrow, you can have 4 and I'll take 2. Kids might say, no, I don't want that. That's unfair, even at an advantage, right? And so there seems to be this period in which the norm of fairness, the norm that if there's just a kind of a windfall of resources, we should split that really equally, is a norm that kids really strongly feel, and will do so again, even when, even at a cost to themselves. Now, that's not yet punishment, but that's this kind of norm that they seem to hold, right? They seem to hold this belief that the fair way to deal with resources is to split them equally. So the way the punishment studies generally work is kids now observe someone else, maybe another kid, making a distribution that's fair or unfair. And when the distribution is unfair, they can say, do something, maybe spend a resource, a candy or a sticker or something that they have to, in some sense, sort of to punish the unfair actor, basically. And in different studies, there's different forms of punishment. There's forms where you just try to re-equalize it in some way, or there's ones where you take the resources away from the person who was unfair. But the general pattern is that kids are often inclined to pay a cost to enforce this kind of what you might think of as this norm of fairness. And I think that's, broadly speaking, the way I think about it is just that kids believe this is what we're supposed to do and are willing to enforce that norm, right? They're willing to make it costly to someone else who violates that norm.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. I mean, so years ago, I remember first reading about a related concept, maybe it's the same concept, but altruistic punishment was the term that I kept bumping into. And there are these guys, what were their names? Fair and something. Fair and...
totally. Yeah, Ernst Fair for sure, yes.
Yeah, Fair and Goctor, that's right. And they had this thing around altruistic punishment, and they were using sort of betting games where people are playing poker and somebody starts cheating, and then you give them the chance, you give everybody else the chance to like blow up their own stake in order to kick this guy out of the game, basically. And people would take it. And I remember reaching out to them way back when and asking, do you think this is why in politics you have people so often voting against their own self-interest because they are so outraged by what they consider to be unfairness in the rest of the political world? And this is why people who would, seeing gender affirming care being paid for by some kind of medical insurance would be willing to blow up their own medical insurance to take that away. And these very reasonable European researchers were like, I have no comment. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. But I've been citing altruistic punishment for a long time in that context. And so I think it's so interesting that I love that it starts from, I've always assumed it was just from the place of we want to keep the group together and therefore we should punish anyone who threatens that cohesion. But I love that kids also are sort of like, that kids will also refuse to take more than their fair, amount. That's right. That's lovely.
Right. I mean, there is an interesting little kind of side debate happening in the literature about how often does this kind of punishment really happen in the wild, right? So these are all somewhat contrived experiments where you're giving the child like a specific set of options. And one worry that comes, or adults for that matter, like there's a lot of adult work on this kind of these kinds of economic game, like punishment strategies as well, or punishment behavior. And there's a sort of worry that if you confront me with a choice, hey, so-and-so's been unfair, do you want to take action or do you want to do nothing? That there's a little bit of a demand effect, as we say in psychology, right? A little bit of a social pressure on me to exhibit my strong reputation that I'm a good cooperator. I enforce the norms. I'm someone that you would want to cooperate with. Let me demonstrate that now. And that these kinds of game tasks might elevate the levels of punishment. And that what tends to happen more in the real world, at least according to one argument, is that if I've observed that you are unfair a lot, I will just decide I'm not going to cooperate with you. I'm not going to reciprocate with you. I'm going to it's basically going to be like a social exclusion. I'm going to cut you out of my social network rather than pay the cost of punishment, which both is costly, also is kind of aggressive towards you, right? Like you're going to be mad at me if I'm a third party bystander and I've just taken away your stuff, right? You're going to be mad that I might invite reprisals. So the real world is more complicated than those, than the games.
I think what I'm realizing, if nothing else in this conversation, that Yarrow Dunham, you must be an incredible Settlers of Catan player. Like I don't know, like you must rock at that game. I was just talking with somebody yesterday about how the ultimate, the most losing strategy you can pursue in that game is, first of all, to become sentimentally attached to having the longest road, and second of all, being capriciously cruel all the time, because no one will trade with sheep with you anymore, and you are out. That is hilarious.
It's all about laying low as long as you can.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm always about encouraging everyone else in their strategies. I'm always saying, great idea. Well, you're doing great. Yes. This is so great. I just want, and I do a lot of, there's a lot of trading. I let people freely use my ports whenever they need to. That's my way of building goodwill over time for a small fee. Okay. So if you're going to, before we now pivot to the digital thing, let's just sort of like, let's just recap what we know. And maybe one way to think about this is to like, if extraterrestrials touch down in a flying saucer and come to you and say, Professor Dunham, we need you to give us a crash course in Homo sapien children and their tendencies. Give us like, in the work that you have done, give us the like précis, the 90-second summary of like, what are the tendencies of kids in terms of their in-group, out-group tendencies and in terms of their attitudes toward fairness?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms, so with respect to the first, kids are, we are an intensely social animal. We are looking for, you put it as our tribe. I think that's a nice way it's just a nice shorthand. We're looking for our people. We're looking for our tribe. And the world, especially in contemporary societies, is very complex. There are a lot of different, so they're needing to search through and they're needing to figure out what kinds of people are there that are socially meaningful? And then which ones of those am I, right? Which of those clusters am I involved with or do I belong to? So I think that search for social belonging, search for their social place is one of the kind of fundamental things that young children are invested in. And that will continue actually at least through adolescence in all these interesting and complex ways as they, maybe begin to question the first set of decisions they made in that regard, right? As a more, say, stereotypically rebellious adolescent or something like that.
And the big variables are what we would imagine. They are race, they are gender, are they the sort of the classics? Like, do
Yes, I
those
think
all
those are big
hold?
ones. But it's very, it depends very much on your cultural setting. So we've also done, for example, we've done research in India where like caste and religion are really, really important ones. Of course, gender, I think, is as close to a universal one as we're going to find. Um, age is one that is very different in interesting ways, but is certainly salient, right? Like grown-ups versus kids. But yeah, and so there's a lot of cultural variability. And yeah, and I think this is always going to be crossed with things like social status. So kids are very sensitive to the sort of consensual kind of status positions, the kind of socioeconomic status. So the kids are certainly tuned in to wealth and poverty from an early age, to kind of in general high status, low status, and that actually crosscuts with group biases in really interesting ways. Actually, in that very often kids from, say, let's say disadvantaged or stigmatized groups. So for example, say Black or Latino kids in the United States show weaker forms of in-group bias with respect even to their own racial group. So you can kind of imagine one very, I think, a little bit too simplistic, but I think good shorthand to think about this is we have a tendency to have both an in-group preference and a high status preference. And for, someone like me, a white kid growing up in the United States, those are pointing in the same direction. So those are just, but if those two things are pointing in opposite directions, then you get some attention, then they're going to have to reach some kind of balance. So for example, in the United States, using some of these sort of implicit bias measures, I know you've talked about before, but these more kind of automatic measures of prejudice, well, we often would find that, say, Black or Latino kids are actually unbiased on those measures on average. If you go to somewhere like South Africa, where the racial disparities are extremely, like, are harsher, we actually see in certain cases, like on average, Black kids in South Africa showed a white over Black implicit preference. So it
Wow.
actually seemed like the status effect was big enough to not just cancel out, but to actually like push other way, right? So that status
Wow.
dimension is also hugely important.
And I mean, this explains why I talked to a children's television producer and researcher whose whole thesis was that one of the ways we are continuing to sort of push racial preferences in the world essentially is that the business logic of exporting a children's television program around the world was it had to star a white kid. And that was because you needed to either make a localized version of the show for every country in which it stars the dominant ethnic group there, or make it a white
Right.
kid because everybody's into white kids was essentially the business
Right.
assumption. That's the cynical
Yeah.
way that business had taken
Right.
what you'd
That's right.
learned.
And also that whiteness can kind of stand in as this default. And there's also really interesting research about gender, about this sometimes called androcentrism, that, ask most people, just like imagine a person. Men overwhelmingly imagine a man, women are a little more balanced, but there's all these contexts in which the default is a man. In the United States, the default is a white man. The kind of
Right.
quintessential human is a white man. And, this has all kinds of really, shocking downstream effects. I mean, some of my favorite examples of the gender one are, for example, all of the kind of common symptoms of what happens if you're having a heart attack, and the things you need to watch out for turn out to be things that are primarily true of men having heart attacks.
Yes.
So the
Right.
symptoms that women have are a little different. And so like public health campaigns were basically just leaving out women. Airbags and kind of restraint systems in cars had the same system. People had to realize, wait, why are women having worse outcomes in traffic accidents? And it turned out that we were not respecting differences in like average male and female bodies, and we were designing for male bodies, right? And so these are
Wow.
things that like you'd think this should be a huge scandal, right? That should be huge news for years and years. I mean, these are kind of old stories now, but why were these not huge scandals? Again, it's sort of like, oh, well, that's the default. Yeah, we move
Right.
on.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So, and then last sort of summary statement for the extraterrestrials, it sounds like, is a deep instinct for fairness. We have a
That's right.
powerful, powerful desire
That's
to
right. So
impose
kids, yes.
fairness.
Yeah. And I think really one of the fascinating questions, though, that we're still working on is kids definitely, and this seems to be fairly consistent across cultures, have a very strong orientation towards fairness and sort of middle childhood, say, 8, 9, 10. It's clear, though, that by the time we're adults, we're okay with many forms of inequality and unfairness. So something kind of interesting goes on in those intervening years. I think a lot of it has to do with ideologies about meritocracy. So if you think about, so one case in which even kids are okay with inequality is if it feels like a fair inequality, which often means something like, well, somebody worked harder, someone did better, so maybe it's okay that they get a little more.
Right. What's
But
the
we
what's that
know,
one, the cricket that plays until the snows arrive, and then he's
yeah,
starving, and all of the good worker ants had put away the food. There's a famous
mm.
kid story that I remember being very, where the cricket
Oh
fiddles
yes,
all summer while the
yes,
ants are
yes, yes.
storing their food,
Right,
and then
that's
he
right.
has
Who
to
had worked
come.
hard? Yeah,
Yeah,
to
who had worked hard
stock
and
in
who
food for the
hadn't.
winter.
That's right.
Right. And then the people who lazed or loafed are coming around asking for handouts. Now, of
Right.
course, I tend to think these are really pernicious ideologies, right? Like things like the Protestant work ethic, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, of course, there's something really right about it that we all can get behind, that you need to work hard. You need to, you need to strive. To me, the real danger is that then and if you really embrace that, the inverted reasoning becomes really problematic. So if what you need to do to succeed is pull yourself up by your bootstraps, well, now, oh, that person has not succeeded. They're struggling. I guess they didn't work hard. So it's that
Yeah.
inverted
Right.
reasoning that is really pernicious and that we see as, I think, like a real driver, of a lot of inequality and, and political struggles here, right? Those sort
Yes,
of
that's right. I mean,
arguments.
that's the campaign message now, right? So,
That's right.
okay,
That's right.
so now let's port what we have established as as the sort of the ground truth of the work you've done over now to this weird digital moment that we are all
Yeah.
living in, right? So, have you ever been approached by one of the big companies to work for them? I have to assume somebody came to
Not
you
in
and
any
said,
serious way. No.
because man, I mean, one of the themes of my career, right, is seeing folks like you get vacuumed up by
Yeah.
one of these companies, because it is just classic. And in many cases, these companies do an incredible job of both giving, like, bringing you in, but also somehow endowing your department so that you can keep your
Oh, that's right.
university
Yeah.
title, and then
That's right.
you can
Yeah.
sort of pretend to continue to be an independent academic even as you're helping them. I've
That's
met
right.
many academics in that sense. So
Yeah. I
anyway,
mean, yeah, yeah. We are increasingly seeing students, and I have had students that have gone and worked for the big tech companies.
mm,
And in part, the academic job market is a beast and it's
right.
hard and you have to move wherever to get the job wherever. And then someone's like, I'll pay you, more money than your advisor makes right now as a fresh,
That's right.
fresh out of
That's
school.
right. You'll never
Come
deal.
do
You'll never deal with an institutional review board again. You'll have a
exactly.
million people's data to play with. That's exactly right. I mean, I do not blame these kids for what they go
Totally.
and do. So, but that you know that I from the earliest days of my career, right? I've spent time with these researchers who were looking at the elements of addiction, or the elements of
Mm.
people's why loot boxes work, right? I mean, people studying this stuff, and then they get pulled into these companies. And in the case of social media, right, I think that your fundamental finding that in-group out-group preference is so powerful. I don't know, riff for me a moment on like what it is to have a business model that's built on the idea that we're going to find people of the same, what they call in the industry, revealed preferences, their
Mm.
unconscious preferences. We're going to group them together by those preferences, and feed them similar information, encourage
Yeah.
them to sort of connect in these different ways. That, I mean, no wonder that business model's worked so incredibly well.
Yeah. That's right. I think it's the mix of, right. It's that pairing up, and then it's that coupled with the way in which engagement works and the way in which certain kinds of material, things that seem shocking, things that are highly emotional, highly moralized, that those are the things that tend to attract engagement. And so if you couple that sort of psychological phenomenon in how cost free it is to, retweet, say, or, to spread negative messages or to just be kind of nasty. And you couple that with the way in which it's clustering us and then sending us things designed to outrage us, because those create engagement. That combination is really polarizing. I mean, coming back maybe to the kind of research that I've done, I talked a lot about all these ways in which we can induce bias really easily by just putting you into a random group. But I think a really important, like, extra detail is that what that bias is that you like your own group more. You don't automatically like the other members of the other group. We're kind of are really still at the baseline of where someone who's not part of any group would be, where if you just rated a stranger with no groups involved. So the out group is just kind of, you could think about, you're just focused on the in group, you like them more, but the out group is just not that relevant. They're just kind of like strangers. When this changes is if you have something like competition, some other form of polarization, some other form of like negativity emerging between the two groups, that's when the other group becomes disliked. So the other group goes from neutral to dislike. So there's a way in which I feel like social media has engineered this kind of perfect environment to maximize those two things, like alignment with people similar to you, and then to really amp up the polarization and the potential feeling of threat or competition or negativity towards the other group.
Right. So it is. It's it's sort of a perfect recipe for um, tickling both of those qualities that you have analyzed.
Right.
Okay. So now, at this point, I think everybody is kind of really familiar with the idea that that social media has sort of has carved us up along the most sort of fundamental parts of our brainstem. So now we're entering this world in which we're going to start getting our ground truth in theory from these automated systems that are going to deliver the verdict to us. You mentioned earlier the tendency of in a design system to use men, and especially white men, as sort of the standard. So I know your former advisor, I can't remember what her relationship is. Masrin Badaji.
Advisor for sure. Yeah,
she was your advisor,
one of my
right?
two main PhD advisors.
So Masrin Badaji at Harvard, who we interviewed in an earlier episode, and coined the term implicit bias, also a real heavyweight in that field. She's now been doing all this work on LLMs and thinking about that stuff. And she described one finding in which when you ask these systems to give you a human, it always gives you a white dude, a picture of a white dude. And so for you, like if you were gonna, I guess help us think through a little bit about how the folks that, what you tend to hear from people who make these systems is, we have just taken human tendencies into this system, and then the debate that comes up is, how do we, are we supposed to be putting our thumb on the scale to correct for what is biased or not in these inputs in the training data, and people are very divided about that, whether they should be even getting involved at all, or whether these systems should simply try to should just be a faithful representation of the statistical likelihoods in how humans write shit on the internet. Is basically it, right? And so when I think about like given what you know about that world, given that what you know about how humans develop these tendencies, what is it like for you to watch the generative AI world take over as it is?
Yeah, I mean, so many different things come to mind. I mean, in one part, because one of my hats is an educator, a professor teaching classes, realizing that more and more students are using this. Then as a developmental, scientist, as well as a parent, I have a 9-year-old now, realizing the extent to which that, like, her generation, this is just going to be part of the backdrop of her generation. Maybe not quite at age 9, but certainly she knows about these. We've played with them. She knows about them. Like they're in her, kind of orbit already. And then also just the form of social interaction that they create with people. I know you've done some interviews and some thinking about whether it's a strong term like AI psychosis, or just the very strong forms of bonding that some people experience working within these systems. I mean, some of that is both intellectually fascinating, but also disturbing in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I just threw out a lot. I don't know. I'll let you say.
Well,
where do you want to go there?
Let's do that part of it first. So first of all, let's talk about just sort of maybe the way in which we might, based on what you understand of how we form attachments and loyalties to individuals, to groups, and to concepts of fairness. Tell me a little bit about how you think that would lead us to attach to the input of a model like that, right? These are products built to personify, to be as if they're a person in our lives. Oh, Jake, it's great to see you again. Great question. Given our past conversations on this subject, can I suggest this to you? So the language of someone who's certainly in our group, right? There's this feeling that this bot is is on the team, right? Is
Totally.
on my team in some way. So tell me a little bit about how
Yes.
you can do we think that people can attach to these systems in the way that a kid in a green shirt or a kid in an orange shirt attaches to other
I
kids in a
think,
similar
yeah,
color?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think a few things that come to mind. One is just that throughout our life history, but also throughout like evolutionary history, throughout the history of our species, any agent that any, so-called agent that we could interact with that could interact with us the way these systems could was a full-fledged agent of some sort, like probably another human, maybe another animal, right? Like, and we have these incredibly rich systems for perspective taking. Like we track the perspective of other people automatically. We track where they're looking. We track where they're walking, which we are constantly inferring their beliefs and their desires. And that's really, really useful because if I know like what you believe and what you want, I can probably predict what you're going to do, right? So this is this kind of classic person perception kind of, set of thoughts. And LLMs, for example, really do a really good job giving those same signals, these signals that have been always an incredibly reliable signal to the presence of a full-fledged agent with its own beliefs and desires and goals and all of that. And, like a real full-fledged agent. And so one thing is we just have minds that for very good reasons have gotten good at inferring that about forms of intelligence, about other animals, about people. And so it feels to me very natural that once the system gets to a certain level of competence, that's going to start happening there too. And, I think what we actually know that didn't have to be that competent, the history of like the early chat bots and all of that, where a lot of people inferred a lot just from these, what we know are very canned, very limited set of responses, right? So building up to where we are now, it feels very natural that the way in which we project minds onto other people, and we build a theory of what's going on in the minds of our interlocutors, and that's really valuable, that of course is going to happen here.
It really, I mean, it speaks to just how, I mean, what it shows on the one hand, like you've spent a career showing how, in a way, how sophisticated these attachment systems have been and how these tribal groups are, how sophisticated our systems are for creating these attachments. But what I think these systems are showing us, what the LLMs are showing us, is just that that the barrier to entry is maybe not as high as we thought, kind of,
That's
that
right.
that it actually, once you check a couple of fundamental boxes, it doesn't take that much
That's right.
to set these instincts off.
That's right. Yeah. And again, I think the thing to emphasize is that mostly that makes sense, right? If we put, generative AI aside, that's good. If something that you're interacting with is seeming to show all these signatures of pursuing goals and having beliefs, it does, right? Like it basically, this is good, right? Like this is good for reasoning
Right.
about
Why waste
humans.
time? Why waste
Exactly.
time investigating it further? This is a good one.
Exactly.
I can trust
Exactly.
this.
Right. We'll
Yeah.
leave it to the philosophers to like, struggle with the philosophy of other, the other minds, or or maybe someone else is a zombie with no internal mental states or whatever. Like a really good default for understanding why people do what they do is to project these kinds of mental states onto them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I wanted to then add, though, coming back to the other kind of piece of it that you mentioned about, for lack of a better word, the way in which these systems are often somewhat sycophantic, that my questions are always such a good question, my responses are always so wise, that, they are really, and this is kind of interesting, I guess I'm very curious, and maybe, I don't know if you know more about this, about the underlying, like why, like that seems like something that, I don't know, does that just fall naturally out of the training data, or is that
Nope.
something that they built in, right? That's something they want to do that to make us engage more. And, most people I know have prompts to try to make it do that less with their big users, and like,
here's what I know about this. So the sycophancy of these systems. So I interviewed a guy on the show several weeks ago named Zachary Gidwitz, who has a system called Open Recovery, and it's a chatbot-based system, an LLM-based system for getting people pushed toward a recovery program, people who are suffering from addiction. And he very quickly realized that you can't have it do what the default systems are doing. It can't constantly be flattering you. It can't constantly be telling you what a good idea, because the essence of recovery therapy tends to be, I think you may be deluding yourself about this, or I notice a pattern in the way you have, rationalized this over time, that kind of stuff. And so I asked him, well, how hard was it to change the off-the-shelf settings so that this system is less sycophantic? And he didn't want to badmouth the big boys, but he basically said, he said, it's surprisingly easy. He said, it's far easier than I would have expected.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, what does that tell you? And he's like, well, it tells me that it's a choice. It's a design choice on the part of the company, right? So we know that. The other thing that we know is when, in OpenAI's case, when they had a 4.0 system that was extremely sycophantic,
Right.
right? And then they switched to this 5.0 system that was much less so. And they did a big product presentation where they were showing all kinds of crazy stuff. This thing can be your cancer doula, and it can do this and this and this and this for you. And at the end, in the Q&A section, what I would have assumed would have been all kinds of philosophical questions about all kinds of things that you and I have been talking about in this hour. Instead, basically every single question was, how do I get 4.0 back? I hate the new 5.0 system. I miss my old system.
Right.
And you know, I mean, I think that really says something about what we're talking about here. That checkboxes
That's right.
Are very powerful.
Well, yeah, that's right. And I was actually I think maybe because I listened to a little bit of the podcast that you do with Mahzarin Banaji that you mentioned before, and Cialdini came up, this kind of father of the study of influence and persuasion. And that got me thinking about this a little bit with respect to the energy, that this vibe, this whatever sycophantic or whatever we want to say. And it made me go back and look at this book that I came across when I was a much younger person, this famous Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Right.
And I ended up just going back to read the he provides all these lists, right? And the lists actually sound a lot like ChatGPT. So, remember that a person's name is the sweetest and most important sound to them in any language. Be a good listener, encourage them to talk about themselves, talk in terms of the other person's interests. It
is true, right? That is the language. It's always like, great job, right. Yarrow. Good idea, right. Yarrow. Let's do this again,
wrong,
Yarrow.
Admit it quickly and emphatically. And it's kind of wrong a lot. And when you say, oh, hey, you just said something that doesn't make any mistake. Thank you for catching that. Right. I'm so glad you pointed that out.
That's right.
Never.
That's
and
right.
One of them is never say you're wrong to the other person. Another thing that it won't, that it's very hard. It won't tell you that, or it's unlikely to tell you that you've just made a factual error presupposed in your question.
Right. And again, Dale Carnegie's job is not getting us to know ourselves better. It is not to bring people together for a shared consensus on a tough task. His job is to win friends and influence people. That's right. It's to sell you stuff.
Exactly.
So that's right. That's exactly right.
So the ways in which this creates a kind of a relationship, if we want to use that word, that is predicated on that rather than on another actual human being who really has their own sets of goals and will push back on you in ways that are the productive raw material of real relationships and real growth, right?
That's right.
The lack of that is, I think, is trouble. I mean, despite, I think there are many ways in which they're amazing technologies, and that would be a separate conversation we could have.
Yeah, that's right. So I remember once upon a time when we first met, we were talking about this sort of the shock. I mean, for me, what was this shocking experience of seeing that you group kids together by random T-shirt colors, they make these wild assumptions about one another. And then you went on to point out that not only do they do that, but that over time, the bean counter nature of our brains takes each instance in which we have made a wild assumption about somebody else and thinks of that as evidence. Yeah. And soon we're building a little mountain of beans that says kids in the orange shirts are always evil. Yeah. And so to my mind, I think about, whether we're talking about this happening inside one of these models, because this is going to reflect, of course, how we have built evidence over time. I mean, maybe that's the way to get at this. If we assume that the writing on the internet is based on these mistaken bodies of evidence that people are assembling for themselves and taking as gospel, and then you pour all of that into an automated system, I have to assume that we are then in a world in which people who want to trust these systems are receiving mistaken evidence as gospel from a voice they are mistaking as gospel. I don't know. I just feel like this is it's like somebody invented the perfect way of taking what you have figured out, vacuuming it up, and making it inarguable.
Mm. Well, yeah, right. You're this kind of loop where
not to push everyone back to the title of my book every time, but
yes.
That's right.
That was for you. I worked that in for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That was very, very natural.
Yeah, basically, these architectures are this kind of amazing architecture for a kind of an averaging, right? They're getting us to this kind of modal, like the modal belief of our society in some sense that I think is interesting. But that's what it's going to tend to feed back to us, in both. So that's both communicating that to us, also as more and more content that we consume, but also that the next generations of these models consume is generated by that process. You're kind of like feeding that sort of modal average back into itself as well as back into our minds in this way that is, strange and problematic and seems like it's going to be an amplifier of those things, right? It's going to sort of continue. It's going to, in some sense, maybe coming back to the example you gave, it's sort of becoming evidence in some very broad sense, in some non-precise sense for that conclusion, right? It's like, it's more grist for the mill of that conclusion because it's being fed back in this cyclical way.
And is your sort of attitude toward these patterns that you have discovered one of, we've identified these patterns and as a result, we need to sort of be smart about how we choose to resist them? Is that fundamentally there's some people I speak to in your world who believe that, who sort of look at it and say, well, these systems have done us a lot of good and so it's less about pushing against them. But in your case, we're talking about things that are clearly in the modern world. Our job in a way is to not fall into the patterns that you've identified.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I think it's partly about, I would say it starts, and one of the reasons I'm a developmental scientist in the first place is I strongly believe that that if we want to make change, we need to understand where the problems came from. And a lot of these problems, a lot of these kinds of things, these social biases, like they didn't just suddenly spring, like a joke or a comment we developmentalists make a lot is like, this stuff didn't just spring up in the mind of the 18-year-old who can sign their own consent form. Like these things have a long history, right? 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, all through this period, although going back to infancy, kids are, they're the ultimate sponges, right? They're building this knowledge base based on input, and we need to understand those processes if we want to effectively intervene on them in positive ways. And maybe that means identifying particular kind of sensitive periods where intervention is going to be more effective. Maybe it's just understanding that trajectory and like how individual differences and where you're situated, who you interact with, who your parents are, how those things matter. These are all going to give us the kind of the inspiration, hopefully, for change efforts, right? For intervention efforts.
So with that spirit in mind, as we wind down here, let's think a little bit about what the sort of, we talked about some of the pro-social purposes of the tendencies that you have identified, the ability to collaborate and owe each other a favor over a long period of time, the ability to kind of come together and mesh. I'm in a very bad but very enthusiastic cover band, and we are always remarking on the amazing difference between one jam session and another, and how sometimes you just click in and it's not clear what the magic is that's making that happening, and sometimes you don't. But right, that magic of cohesion that you have measured and identified over time, I'm trying to think of ways in which we could think about deploying some of the same instincts and the same tendencies that you've measured, especially now in a world in which those are being vacuumed up and regurgitated to us in a product like AI. I don't know, when you think about, I remember when we first met, I believe it was the eve of the Trump election, the first Trump election, or maybe he had just won, I can't remember. And we were talking about these tendencies, and you said something very funny. You said there's a bumper sticker going around that said "Giant Meteor for President 2016." It was a bumper sticker that was popular at the time. It was just like big flaming meteor,
That's right.
And you said, and you were saying, you're like, this is actually a good summary of what we could be doing, which is taking, like, that we do well against a common enemy. That tends to bring us together in this same way that these tendencies can take us apart. Now, 10 years on, where's your head at about sort of how you could use some of what you've learned in a pro-social way?
Yeah, right. Because the common enemy one is, there's some allure to it, but it obviously has its serious dangers. Because then you have that enemy, and what's going to happen there, right? And so, so and that's one that I think is.
We only tend to find enemies here on this planet. We don't have any extraterrestrials to fight against right now. That's right.
I guess. So the optimistic thing that I would say, and this came up a little bit earlier, is that these are like pretty automatic kind of reflexive operations of our mind. So if you can get someone to think of a stranger as a member of their group, they like that person more, and they like that person more even if they belong to a different race, gender, religion, nationality, what have you, right? So it's actually a pretty easy lever to create. And there's a lot of people have done work where you create these like cross-cutting groups. So you have teams that are mixed race, but you're on the red team and the other team's the blue team. And in that context, race bias gets down-regulated. You see less race bias. You see now your team bias. And so one of the things that says is that there is a surprising amount of flexibility in this system, that we can rewrite the group lines pretty quickly. And in the finding of mine that I mentioned, if you let people think they're going to cooperate with the people they've thought of as outgroup members, something changes right then and there. You become more positively predisposed towards it. So I think that's a really positive thing. I guess where it gets trickier for me is if I really think about, well, how do we kind of leverage those ideas at scale? It's like probably means we need these more, these bigger, more structural, systemic kind of institutional changes, right? We need to be putting in kind of physical structures into our world that make us interact across, we need to be less segregated, say, if we're thinking about race, right? We need less gender segregation at the upper levels of, certain kinds of occupations or whatever. We need to actually create the grounds for the kinds of interactions that would make all those things I just mentioned kind of play out. And that's maybe why the last decade has been a very sad moment when it seemed like maybe we were headed one direction with all of that and have taken this right turn, right?
Do you think that, you have measured the tipping point past which people's tendencies toward tribalism and the rest of it get triggered? Yeah. Do you think that if somebody gave you the keys to the car, at a systemic scale, you could tell us at what point in a system, this amount of exposure to a different person or this amount? If you were given, endless resources and magical powers, and you were allowed to organize, corporations and governments and so forth the way they were supposed to go, would you know, in a sense? It sounds like your field knows, in a sense, how you would need to put people together to get them to be more cohesive, to fight against some of these instincts. Do you feel like because I take some comfort from the idea that you might know the numbers in theory.
Yeah, I think we know some. Yeah, I think we know more, actually, and kind of interestingly, we know more about how to say like reduce bias in sort of more majority, more privileged people. And it's often about having just really positive interactions with members of other groups. In part, that's because there's this big asymmetry, right? You can be a, wealthy white person in this country and have very few like meaningful interactions with, say, racial outgroup members, or very few interactions that are anything other than, whatever, like in the service industry or something like that, right? The other one is not the case. If you're a racial minority in this country, you have, just because of numbers, a lot of interactions with members of, with, say, higher status groups, with, say, white Americans. And so there's this asymmetry in just kind of how much contact experience you even have, right? And so giving a little bit of high quality contact experience, which we know a lot about, it means things like, in the context of that contact experience, you're on equal footing, and you have common goals, and you kind of share goals and outcomes. So that if those things exist, if there's equal status, those kinds of things, then that creates a really positive and a really beneficial form of contact. Unfortunately, a lot of the actual contact we have maybe does not have those.
Yeah, I guess the good news I think of is, even though we're in this stupid moment where people are complaining about, woke AI models and the rest of it, what's so stupid about that is that it truly is the case that if you could change the math on it a little bit, you could actually maybe change someone, even someone who's deeply isolated and doesn't get a lot of actual human contact with people from other backgrounds. Yeah. You could give them the experience of that if their only contact was through something like an AI product, and maybe actually, change the math for them a little bit.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, and I think there's reason to think that would work. There's research with kids on what's sometimes called extended contact, or there's a few versions of it. There's extended contact, there's imagined or indirect contact. So reading stories about people like you who have really meaningful relationships with people from different groups actually does have some benefit. Or having a friend who has those relationships can have benefit, even if they're not your friends. You know, the one friend over is not your friend. So I think that would be, I think, supportive of what you just suggested. That this could actually be. Now, of course, right, coming back to our prior discussion, we'd have to make sure that what we were getting from that system was not the kind of stereotyped version that we have reason to think right now, left to its own devices, it might be, right?
Right. So it seems like take note, AI makers. If you keep perpetrating the average, you're gonna continue to reinforce the wrong kind of assumptions. But if we were to actually put our thumb on the scale a little bit and tweak it, you could conceivably change people's the bean counter experience.
That's right. Or I wonder if there would be something, in between putting thumbs on the scales and not, that would be more like maybe coming back to this idea of specialized systems for specific things. Like, what if you put your thumb on the scale in terms of what, like doing more restriction at the level of the training data, right? What if this was, to try to make sure you're not training it on the kinds of data that are most biased, most problematic, right? I don't know exactly, obviously much harder in practice than in theory, but it seems like you can imagine training one up on, whatever, literature by non-white folks or something like that. Like,
exactly.
what does that model look like?
That's right. No, there's a way, I think, it sounds like, what I think the modern era has taught us is that simply vacuuming up the average and treating that as ground truth is putting us in a terrible place and reinforcing some stuff that we've spent all of modern civilization trying to fight back against. And the idea that is just being sort of a realist, I think, is one of the laziest and most destructive impulses that these folks tend to have. So I really appreciate you giving us the ability to see that as clearly as we do here. So,
pleasure.
Yarrow Dunham, Yale University, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to chat, Jake. Thank you.
The Rip Current is produced and created by me, Jacob Ward. And if you liked this show and you want more content like this, go to theripcurrent.com, where I publish a weekly newsletter that covers these same sorts of stories of the big invisible forces that have us all in their grip. And if you want to really do me a favor, if you could go to where you have listened to this or watched it and like it, share it, or even better, review it. Holy cow, is that helpful? It's the best possible way for me to find a new audience. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening.